So that's actually your seventh point. We've skipped the ones in between. Let's go back to number 3, integration.
Yeah, well, that comes with what we were discussing out of the welfare issue and getting people into work, that we need to ensure that all ethnic groups embrace Australian values and make a positive contribution, and there should be a big emphasis on integration and even more integration and English language skills in particular, that people can't be a regular part of the community if they can't talk to others in the language of the nation. So that's another area where there's been a lot of tolerance that, oh, well, you know, people come here, they haven't got English language skills. Well, we've got to demand those skills to ensure that people can get to know each other and integrate into the community at the basic level of communication.
Now, your fourth one is a fantastic idea, and that's modernise Islam. Now, I think that's fantastic because I think it will expose the limits of the value of the ideology. I don't think it's possible. But I'd love to encourage them to give it their best shot. I'd love to see it I'd love to be proven wrong.
Well, I think political leadership in that area is important because some Islamic leaders say that their holy book is set in stone, it can't be changed. But at various times, someone has been promoted through the public broadcaster and subsidised in various ways as Waleed Ali, who has said that Islam is a work in progress, that the holy book can be updated at any time. Well, why isn't there political pressure on him to play a role in his community, to take out the sections of the Quran that deal with domestic violence and slaughter and jihadism, and ensure that it fulfills what a lot of the Islamic leaders say, that it's a book of peace? Well, if it's a book of peace, it should be reflected that way in its actual wording. So there's one Islamic leader that has got all sorts of positions and public encouragement, Waleed Ali, saying that modernisation of the Quran is possible. So shouldn't there be pressure on him to fulfil that and actually do it, instead of, well, in a lot of cases, him being very much part of the Be Nice Brigade? So I would have thought a dialogue between our political leaders and Islamic leaders like him to encourage that modernisation would be very helpful. But we don't even get off first base, do we? There's no sort of part of the Turnbull Shorten philosophy is, oh, we can't even talk about that. That's intruding on someone else's religion. Well, I think these problems are so stark, you've got to confront obvious difficulties.
A modern Western democracy that has handled Islam well is Italy. Not at all a third world, developed, backward, oppressive nation, very advanced and civilised, great place to live. Now, they actually don't recognise Islam as a religion, because to get recognised as a religion in Italy, it has to, the religion that you're submitting for approval has to have compatibility with their constitution. And it's basically saying, hey, if you are culturally opposite to our national values, for example, if you espouse violence and if there's any room for ambiguity in that at all, let alone a historical pattern, then, sorry, you don't get status as a religion. You're not banned. We're just not going to support you, sponsor you, fund you, comfort you. You can do what you want in the privacy of your own home. You can even have meetings, but you're not a recognised religion in our nation. Whereas we're actually funding hugely an ideology that is diametrically opposite to Australian traditional values.
That's right.
Yeah, well, if people can still practice the religion and the religion's got the radical strand, then it will still cause the problem. So I think the bigger thing is to modernise Islam, for Islam to have a reformation, so that the worst parts of those middle-aged teachings can be brought up to date, mainly by deleting them. And I just find it extraordinary that you've got Islamic leaders in Australia like Waleed Ali who say that the Quran is a work in progress. Why isn't there a national dialogue about making that progress in these troubled times? It seems to me extraordinary that it's a no-go zone for our political leaders. I think they should be sitting down with people like him and saying, look, you're a leader, how about getting out there and showing the leadership?
You're absolutely right. If Islam is a work in progress, and if the leaders of Islam in Australia do share our values, it should be 1 + 1 equals reformation, modernisation of Islam.
Yeah, well, we gave this guy a gold logie. How about, getting out there and doing something for it? So,
Number 5, defend our civilisation and culture.
Yeah, well, I think in many respects we're our own worst enemy, because the modern trend through the ABC, the universities, the school system, is to be attacking Western culture and civilisation. And I always make the point, if you're a troubled youth in a place like Lakemba in Western Sydney, you're feeling disaffected with society, and you're being taught safe schools and respectful relationships and gender theory at your school, and you're listening to the rubbishing of our civilisation on the ABC, and you hear we're a nation of bigots and oppressors and racists and wife bashers, well, you probably think, well, they haven't got much of a civilisation that's worth supporting. So if I'm inclined to attack their civilisation, if they don't defend it and support it, why should I? That would be what this young fellow could be thinking. So if we don't get out there and boldly teach the virtues and successes of Western civilisation in our education system, maybe, we shouldn't be too surprised that we've been asking for trouble. So let's get out there and stop apologising for who we are, stop attacking the many, many wonderful achievements of our civilisation and promote it as a virtue. And that may well convince some of the young jihadists to turn to the good side and embrace our values instead of joining the attacks.
We've got a move on the extreme fringe radical left, like the left of the Greens even, that's criticising patriotism, flying the national flag as racism. It's and
attacks on Australia Day. I find it extraordinary. Every year the attacks on Australia Day become more intense, to abolish it, to move it. And all Australia Day is saying is that, without any disrespect to the first Australians, to Indigenous culture, there's a bunch of Australians who feel proud about the arrival of Western civilisation on the 26th of January 1788, and it hasn't been perfect, and there were some historical wrongs, but by and large it's been a wonderful achievement in the settlement of this vast continent, and we're proud of our country. We want to celebrate it on Australia Day. And I find in my community, the more the attacks on the ABC and the more the political elites come out and say abolish Australia Day, the more the public comes out and cheers on the parade. Where I live in Camden, a couple of years ago, people would be sort of 2 deep on the footpath. Now they're 7 and 8 deep on the footpath as the parade goes by on Australia Day, and they're on the median strip. The whole township is full. There's no one left at home. Everyone comes out and celebrates Australia Day. But at elite political level, we're all under attack for patriotism. Patriotism's become a dirty word. Again, it's part of that syndrome of apologising for who we are and having so many attacks on the best parts of our society. If you're a young, disaffected would-be jihadist watching all that, well, it's doing nothing to stop them, is it? We should be letting people know that our civilisation is strong. Australia Day is worth celebrating, and everyone from all religious and ethnic backgrounds should be part of that. Yeah,
I agree. Now, your sixth policy point on fighting terrorism is a travel ban from dangerous countries.
Yeah, well, we know from the list of the 400 on the watch list that if they come from certain countries of origin, if you can see a pattern among the 400 that they're coming from a handful of countries, we'll turn off the immigration tap from those countries. I mean, it's not commonly understood, but large parts of our immigration program are run on the historic results of where people have come from. For instance, it's almost impossible now for a young woman to come from the Philippines on the basis she wants to marry an Australian. That's a program that's been rorted over a long period of time, and within the immigration system they've turned off that tap. Well, if you can see within the 400 on a watch list, they come from countries A, B and C, turn off the immigration, restrict the immigration from those countries of origin, knowing that's what's causing the problem. And it's the equivalent of what Donald Trump's done in the United States. I think it's a sensible approach. If you know certain nations coming here are causing these terrible problems, well, we'll stop that into the future.
Now, I understand from Donald Trump's arguments that that's a short-term solution, a stopgap measure, sensible, because you can cut off the problem straight away. But is it a long-term solution?
Well, it can be. If you're cutting off the flow of people from countries that have caused the trouble, then the trouble should stop. I don't support a blanket Muslim ban, mainly for the reason I know a lot of Muslims in my area who've been very hard workers, set up businesses, good contributors in the community. On my son's school, good friends with the family I've known for a long while who've been Fijian Indian Muslims, kicked out of India for religious reasons, kicked out of Fiji. They've come to Australia and they're great contributors, working hard, business background and the like, good friends with my son. So, you know, there are Muslims who've made a very wonderful contribution to Australia. So a blanket Muslim ban, I always think, would be very hard on families like that who are doing the right thing. But if we can find out where the bad ones have come from and identify those countries, well, clearly you can target that problem and find a solution.
Something Tommy Robinson identifies is that there's a percentage of the population where it switches from successful integration to segregation, that they actually retain more strongly the culture that they've brought with them. So such as, you know, people coming from Syria. So he's basically saying once the population percentage of Muslims in any area or nation gets really high. Now what we see in Italy is that although Muslims are welcome to immigrate to Italy, because they're not going to a country like Germany or France where they're going to get really, really generous welfare and economic accommodation, they're actually not attracted to Italy. They're actually keeping going because it's more financially beneficial for them to go to France or Germany, and guess where the cultural problems are happening? It's not in Italy.
Well, I think you can target the problems. It comes from people from the hardest or radical side of the faith. It comes from people who have been part of the Sunni Shia civil war in the Middle East. So the nature of radicalism is sort of from those cultural and religious foundations. So you can target the problem that way.
Yeah.
I think that's the effective thing to do up front.
Good. 8th point, non-interventionism.
Well, I think we've got to remember that Islamic State filled the gap in Iraq that came out of the Iraq War, the invasion of that country in 2003. And I always think, as we read about the tragedies and grieve for the families that have been affected, that that invasion of Iraq in 2003 has been a big part of the problem, because whatever you thought of Saddam Hussein, he had a pretty good answer for troublemakers in his country. He put them up against the wall and shot them. So better that he was shooting them back then than they come to Australia as refugees and give us the trouble. So I think America in particular, and I think they've learnt this under Trump, needs to appreciate that going into these countries, trying to establish democracy just doesn't work.
Yep.
Don't go invading these countries. Don't go upsetting the sectarian balance. They had a sectarian balance in the Middle East prior to 2003. It's been upset. We've got trouble in Syria. We've got the rise of Islamic State. And these problems are happening as a consequence of that intervention. So, we've got to learn from that era. And not go invading countries in the Middle East, because there's no history of it ever being successful. And what you end up doing is importing their problems to us. We've imported a lot of those conflicts and the religious tensions into our nation, and it makes us less safe.
Now, is there anybody that wants to ask a question about that issue, about the 8-point policies to do that? Yeah, come on up and grab the microphone.
My name is Chris Harper. Mark, I was saying it's very good to meet you again. If you may or may not remember, I was crass enough to come up and get a selfie when you were sitting and talking to Wezra at the Friedman conference.
Oh, okay, that's good. I haven't had as many selfies as Kevin Rudd, so I've got a vague memory of that.
Get them where you can. Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. I'd like your opinion on an issue, and that is, on a number of occasions you have made positive comments about multiculturalism and simply asking, where is it going wrong? An alternative view is that multiculturalism is acting exactly as it was designed to act. It's a socially poisonous doctrine that creates division, and we need to avoid even mentioning the word in a positive way. It doesn't mean that we object to where people come from. It doesn't mean that we object to their culture, most of their cultural values, but we do expect them to integrate. Mm-hmm. And multiculturalism is creating division, not celebrating diversity.
I agree.
Well,
Thanks, Chris.
I've always thought that the theory of multiculturalism is sound, because it is based on integration, that we're a country where people have come from many different parts of the world and they brought with them many cultural habits. But the idea is that we just can't be a nation of separate cultural tribes. We have to have an integration where we support certain Australian values, positive contributions, work, democracy, freedom, and we support those values and practice them as Australians. So I've always thought of multiculturalism as a community of communities, that there's many more things we share than cultural practices that are different. And there's large parts of the country where multiculturalism has been a success. You keep the integrity of your own cultural background, but you can learn things from other people, share some of their cultural habits that you find attractive. But as long as you're practicing integrated values of the nation, speaking English, working hard at school, teaching the kids that they need to get a job, people setting up businesses, making their contribution, then multiculturalism of that kind can be a success. So, you know, several definitions of what multiculturalism is, but for me, it's always been something that in theory can work as long as it's based on that type of integration that I've just mentioned. So I don't regard it as a negative in Australia. It can be a positive. Where it runs into trouble is where political leaders allow or even foster the tribal approach, that communities doing anything because it's part of their cultural integrity that's acceptable. And there's some examples recently where we're starting to have government approval of segregation of cultures. It's only a little thing, but in Western Sydney there's a swimming pool at Auburn where they put up a curtain or petition to separate the Islamic women from the rest of the community. Now, that for me is anathema to what multiculturalism should really be. So I'm not upset or hung up about the term, but it's all in the proper meaning of it, based on integration and commonality, a community of communities, rather than segregation and separatism.
You take anything positive to an extreme and it becomes a negative. So multiculturalism has become cultural relativism, where as long as you claim culture, you're right. We can't criticise it.
Exactly, and that's the manner in which the term multiculturalism is becoming poisonous.
Yeah. I think if we could say multi-ethnicity, fantastic. Ethnic diversity, love it. But we've got Australian culture.
That's right.
And our Australian culture loves to include and weave into our fabric some of the beautiful things from other cultures, but not everything. And multiculturalism is a positive thing, but it's been taken to an extreme as an infinite good in and of itself.
It was never intended that way. When Whitlam and Fraser established multiculturalism, it was to be based on integration and shared values.
Has anybody else got a question based on the 8 immigration? One more and then we'll move on to another topic.
One question regarding radical Islam. Why is our government, they're spreading within the institutions and stuff, Wahhabi Islam, which is from Saudi Arabia, and you know, we're taking vast amounts of money from Saudi Arabia and we're putting it into mosques and building it, and we want to stop the radicalisation, but our government's basically funding it. Like there's a guy over at Griffith University, what's his name, Abdullah Muhammad, he was caught out in 2008 taking money from the Saudis to teach it to bloody students at Griffith University in Brisbane. I don't know if you know about that. You're talking about reform in Islam as well. Why aren't we teaching like a more peaceful sect of it, like Ahmadi Islam? They actually come out and they reject terrorism. Like you see the first lot of London Bridge bombings, all these Muslims came out and rejected it. They were all Ahmadis. They came out in Anzac Day right around the country, and they're saying, you know, we want to embrace your culture, and they're very Western friendly. What's the general consensus amongst the Labor Party with all of that? And from your experience?
You know, the problems you've identified, it's part of the be nice philosophy that we've got to be nice to Saudi Arabia and not call out the funding of Wahhabist radicals. So that's clearly wrong. We've got to be realistic. And if they are funding these people in Australia, then we've got to identify that and turn off the money tap. So you've got to be realistic about that. And the group you mentioned, the moderates, yeah, we should be promoting them. Well, because no one wants to talk realistically about the internal nature and some of the divisions within Islam itself. You know, Australian political leaders are very, very reluctant to talk about these problems in a realistic way, to say, look, this is the reality. and they gloss over it by saying, oh, well, you know, this is not really an act of Islam. Islam's a peaceful religion. It's not indicative that what this terrorist has done. Well, you've got to start to say there are some parts of the Islamic faith, the Wahhabist approach, the radical approach, that fosters these acts of terrorism. So we've got to start to talk about this according to the evidence instead of wishful thinking or nice political talk where you try not to upset anyone. A lot of it's political correctness, that they're trying to ensure that nobody's upset and nobody gets offended by a realistic approach, a realistic description of what's going on.
Thanks for watching. If you really enjoyed that video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Have a look at this great video next and check out the website for even more interesting articles and episodes later.